The autumn wind swept across the grounds of Windsor Castle as King Charles III stood in his private study, staring out at the gardens that had witnessed decades of royal drama. The morning newspapers lay scattered across his mahogany desk, their headlines screaming about another scandal involving Queen Camilla. This time, it wasn't just gossip from the tabloids. This time, it was different. Charles picked up his reading glasses and examined the front page of the Times once more. The photographs were clear, undeniable. Camilla had been caught in what appeared to be intimate conversations with her former lover, Andrew Parker Bowles, at a private club in London. The images showed them holding hands, laughing intimately, completely unaware that photographers were nearby. The king felt a familiar ache in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced years ago when his marriage to Diana had crumbled under similar circumstances. He had thought those days were behind him. After waiting so long to marry Camilla, after weathering the storms of public disapproval and family tensions, he had believed they would finally find peace together. His private secretary knocked gently on the door before entering. "Your Majesty, the Queen Consort is requesting an audience with you. She says it's urgent." Charles nodded slowly, straightening his tie. He had been dreading this conversation, but he knew it was inevitable. When Camilla entered the room, she looked different somehow. The confidence that had always defined her seemed shaken. Her usual perfectly styled hair appeared disheveled, and her eyes were red-rimmed. "Charles," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I suppose you've seen the papers." "Indeed I have," he replied, his tone measured but cold. "Would you care to explain what I'm looking at?" Camilla moved toward the window, avoiding his gaze. "It's not what it appears to be. Andrew and I were simply discussing old times. We share so much history, and with everything that's been happening lately, I needed someone who understood my past." "Your past?" Charles felt his voice rising slightly. "Camilla, you're the Queen Consort now. Your past should remain exactly that, in the past. Do you understand what these photographs mean for the monarchy? For everything we've worked to build together?" She turned to face him, tears now flowing freely. "I never meant for this to happen. I was feeling isolated, Charles. The pressure of being queen, the constant scrutiny, the way some members of the family still look at me as if I don't belong here. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in this life." Charles walked to his desk and picked up another newspaper, this one featuring an editorial questioning Camilla's loyalty to the crown. "The Archbishop of Canterbury has already called me. Parliament is asking questions. The Commonwealth leaders are expressing concerns about the stability of our marriage. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be," Camilla said, stepping closer to him. "But surely we can work through this together. We've overcome so much already." For a moment, Charles felt the old pull toward her, the magnetism that had drawn him to Camilla for over 5 decades. But something had shifted inside him. The weight of the crown, the responsibility to his people, and, perhaps most importantly, the realization that some wounds never truly heal, had changed his perspective. "I don't think we can, Camilla," he said quietly. "Not this time." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the autumn leaves continued to fall, and, somewhere in the distance, the bells of Windsor chimed the hour. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and King Charles III was about to make one of the most difficult decisions of his life. Camilla sank into one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "What are you saying, Charles?" "I'm saying that perhaps it's time we both acknowledged what we've been avoiding for months. This marriage, this life we've tried to build together, it's not working anymore." The Queen Consort looked up at him with a mixture of shock and resignation. "You're talking about separation?" Charles moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "I'm talking about honesty, Camilla. Honest about what we both need, what the monarchy needs, and what the British people deserve." As the afternoon light began to fade, two people who had loved each other for most of their adult lives sat in a room filled with the weight of history and the pain of a relationship that was finally reaching its end. The king knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and new responsibilities. But for the first time in months, he also felt something he hadn't experienced in a long while, a sense of clarity about the path ahead. The morning sun cast long shadows across the breakfast room at Clarence House as King Charles sat alone with his coffee and morning briefings. It had been 3 days since his conversation with Camilla, and the Queen Consort had moved her belongings to their country estate in Scotland. The official story was that she was taking a brief retreat for her health, but Charles knew the truth was far more complicated. His phone buzzed with another message from his private secretary. The media frenzy was intensifying by the hour. Reporters had gathered outside every royal residence, and Social media was exploding with speculation about the royal marriage. The hashtag royal crisis was trending worldwide, and even the international press had picked up the story. Charles set down his cup and walked to his private office, where a secure phone call was waiting. It was his eldest son, William. "Father, we need to talk." William's voice was serious, concerned. "Catherine and I have been watching the news, and we're worried about you. About the family. I appreciate your concern, William, but this is something I need to handle myself," Charles replied, though he was grateful for his son's support. "With respect, Father, this affects all of us. The children are asking questions. Charlotte saw something on television yesterday about grandmother Camilla, and she doesn't understand why people are saying mean things about the family." The mention of his granddaughter struck Charles deeply. Charlotte, now 9 years old, had always been particularly close to him. The thought of his personal struggles affecting the children made his heart ache. Later that afternoon, Charles found himself in an unexpected place, the private gardens of Kensington Palace, walking alongside his daughter-in-law, Catherine. She had requested a private meeting, something that surprised him. Despite their years as family members, they had never been particularly close on a personal level. Catherine wore a simple blue dress and walked with the natural grace that had made her so beloved by the public. Her dark hair moved gently in the autumn breeze as she chose her words carefully. "I hope you don't mind my asking to see you like this," she began, her voice warm but respectful. "I know this must be an incredibly difficult time for you." Charles glanced at her, noting the genuine concern in her eyes. "It's quite all right, Catherine. To be honest, I welcome the company of someone who might understand the complexities of royal life." They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, passing the memorial garden dedicated to his first wife, Diana. Catherine noticed his gaze linger on the white roses planted there. "She would have wanted you to be happy, you know," Catherine said softly, surprising Charles with her directness. "I'm not sure happiness is something I'm entitled to anymore," Charles replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "I made so many mistakes with Diana, and now it seems I've repeated them with Camilla." Catherine stopped walking and turned to face him. "May I speak honestly, Your Majesty?" Charles nodded, curious about what this remarkable young woman had to say. "I think you're being too hard on yourself. Marriage is difficult under the best circumstances, but royal marriage, it's something few people can truly understand. The pressure, the scrutiny, the way every private moment becomes public property. It takes a tremendous toll." They continued walking, and Charles found himself opening up to Catherine in a way he hadn't expected. She listened without judgment, offered insights without presumption, and somehow made him feel less alone than he had in months. "William mentioned that you've been struggling with some health concerns as well," Catherine said gently. Charles sighed. "Nothing serious, according to the doctors. But the stress of recent events hasn't helped. I find myself exhausted in ways I've never experienced before." "Have you been sleeping?" she asked, and her tone reminded him of how a caring daughter might speak to a worried father. "Not well, no? I spend most nights reviewing documents, trying to understand how everything went so wrong so quickly." Catherine smiled slightly. "When I first married William, I used to lie awake wondering if I was good enough, if I belonged in this family, if the people would ever truly accept me. Diana's shadow felt so enormous, and I worried constantly about living up to her legacy." Charles stopped walking, struck by her honesty. "And how did you manage those feelings?" "I realized that I couldn't be Diana, nor should I try to be. I had to find my own way of serving, my own way of being part of this family. And I had to learn to forgive myself for not being perfect." As they walked back toward the palace, Charles felt something shift inside him. For the first time in days, he wasn't thinking about Camilla, about the scandal, about the newspapers. Instead, he found himself appreciating the wisdom and kindness of this young woman who had somehow become more than just his daughter-in-law. "Thank you, Catherine," he said as they reached the entrance. "This conversation has meant more to me than you might realize. Family is about being there for each other, especially during the difficult times," she replied with a warm smile. "If you ever need someone to talk to, please don't hesitate to reach out." That evening, as Charles sat in his study reviewing official papers, he found himself thinking about Catherine's words. For the first time in months, he felt a small spark of hope that perhaps he wasn't as alone as he had believed. 2 weeks had passed since Charles's walk with Catherine, and the situation with Camilla had only grown more complicated. The Queen Consort had issued a public statement through her representatives, apologizing for any misunderstanding regarding the photographs, but maintaining that her friendship with Andrew Parker Bowles was purely platonic. The public, however, remained unconvinced, and the British press was having a field day. Charles found himself spending more time at Highgrove, his beloved country estate, where he could escape the constant buzz of London and the watchful eyes of the media. It was here that Catherine surprised him again by arriving unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, bringing along Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis. "Grandpa King," Charlotte called out as she ran through the gardens, her school uniform slightly disheveled from the car journey. "Mama said you might like some company." Charles knelt down to embrace his granddaughter, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. "My dear Charlotte, what a wonderful surprise. And, Louis, look how tall you've grown." 7-year-old Louis, still shy but warming up quickly, showed his grandfather a drawing he had made during the car ride. It was a picture of the family standing together, with Charles prominently in the center wearing his crown. "We drew this for you because Mama said you've been feeling sad," Charlotte explained with the straightforward honesty that only children possess. She said sometimes grown-ups need reminders that people love them. Catherine approached, carrying a basket that Charles could smell contained fresh bread and homemade soup. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. The children have been asking about you, and I thought perhaps we could all use some time away from London." Over the next few hours, Charles found himself experiencing something he hadn't felt in months: genuine joy. They walked through his organic gardens, with Charlotte asking endless questions about the vegetables and flowers. Louis was fascinated by the chickens and spent nearly an hour watching them with rapt attention. During lunch in the conservatory, Catherine noticed that Charles seemed more relaxed than she had seen him in recent memory. The children chattered about school, their friends, and their upcoming birthday parties, completely oblivious to the royal crisis that was dominating headlines around the world. "This is what I've been missing," Charles said quietly to Catherine as they watched the children explore the greenhouse. Simple moments like these. With Camilla, everything became so complicated, so fraught with history and expectation. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the most important things in life are the simplest ones. A good meal, a child's laughter, a garden in full bloom." "You have a gift for seeing clearly," Charles observed. "How do you manage it? How do you stay so grounded despite everything you've been through?" Catherine considered her answer carefully. "I think it helps that I wasn't born into this life. I had 18 years of being a regular person, of understanding what normal feels like. It gives me perspective when things get overwhelming." Later that afternoon, as they sat in Charles's study while the children napped in the guest room, Catherine brought up something that had been on her mind. "Have you spoken to William about what you're planning to do about your marriage?" Charles set down his teacup and looked out the window. "William has made his feelings clear. He believes I should try to reconcile with Camilla for the sake of stability. But I'm not sure that's possible anymore. What does your heart tell you?" It was such a simple question, but it struck Charles as profound. When was the last time anyone had asked him about his heart rather than his duty or his public image? "My heart tells me that I deserve to be at peace," he said finally. "I've spent my entire life trying to balance what I wanted with what was expected of me. I married Diana because it was the right thing to do, even though I knew we weren't truly compatible. I waited decades to marry Camilla because I thought she was my true love, but perhaps we're too damaged by our past to build a healthy future together." Catherine leaned forward slightly. "And what would peace look like for you?" Charles was quiet for a long moment, watching the late afternoon light filter through the trees. "Honestly, it would look a lot like this afternoon. Simple pleasures, meaningful relationships, the ability to be myself without constantly worrying about scandal or judgment." "That doesn't sound like too much to ask for," Catherine said gently. That evening, after Catherine and the children had returned to London, Charles sat alone in his study with a cup of tea and a legal pad. For the first time since the scandal broke, he began writing down his thoughts, not about royal duties or public statements, but about what he actually wanted for the remainder of his life. At the top of the page, he wrote, "What brings me joy?" Under that, he listed, "My children and grandchildren, my gardens, meaningful conversations, architecture and history, music, quiet mornings, people who see me as Charles, not just as the king." As he looked at his list, he realized that Camilla's name didn't appear anywhere on it. More surprisingly, he realized that many of the items on his list had been present during his afternoon with Catherine and the children. For the first time in weeks, King Charles III went to sleep that night feeling hopeful about the future. The autumn of 2024 marked a turning point in King Charles's life that few could have predicted. 3 months had passed since his separation from Queen Consort Camilla became official, though the palace had carefully managed the public narrative, describing it as a temporary arrangement while both parties focus on their individual well-being and service to the crown. The reality was far more definitive. Camilla had moved permanently to Ray Mill House in Wiltshire, maintaining a small staff and a significantly reduced public schedule. She appeared occasionally at major state events, but their interactions were formal and brief. The warmth that had once characterized their relationship had been replaced by polite civility. During this period, an unexpected friendship had blossomed between Charles and his daughter-in-law Catherine. What had begun as Catherine's thoughtful gesture of support during a difficult time had evolved into something much deeper, a genuine bond built on mutual respect, shared values, and an understanding of the unique pressures of royal life. Their weekly walks had become a cherished routine. Every Wednesday afternoon, when her schedule allowed, Catherine would join Charles for a tour of whichever royal garden they happened to be near. These conversations had become the highlight of Charles's week, offering him the kind of intellectual and emotional companionship he had long craved. On one particularly crisp November afternoon, they walked through the grounds of Windsor Castle, discussing a book Catherine had recommended about sustainable architecture. Charles was struck by how naturally their conversations flowed, how Catherine challenged his ideas without being confrontational, and how she seemed to genuinely enjoy their discussions about everything from environmental policy to classical music. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," Catherine mentioned as they paused near the rose garden, "about finding ways to make your role more personally fulfilling." "Oh," Charles was curious. Catherine had a talent for asking questions that made him examine his assumptions about duty and happiness. What if you didn't have to choose between being the king and being yourself? What if there was a way to be both? Charles smiled at her optimism. "I'm not sure that's possible, my dear. The crown demands certain sacrifices." "Does it, though?" Catherine stopped walking and turned to face him. "Look at what you've accomplished in just these past few months. Your environmental initiatives have gained more international attention than ever before. Your speeches about mental health have resonated deeply with people. Your work with young entrepreneurs has created real opportunities for thousands of people." Charles realized she was right. Despite the personal turmoil of his separation from Camilla, his public work had actually flourished. Without the constant stress of managing a troubled marriage, he had found new energy for the causes he cared about. "I suppose I have been more focused lately," he admitted. "More than focused," Catherine said with enthusiasm. "You've been yourself. The king the people need isn't someone playing a role. It's Charles who happens to be king." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of children's laughter. Charlotte and Louis had arrived with their nanny for a surprise visit, having finished their lessons early. Charles watched as Catherine's face lit up at the sight of her children, and he felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the autumn sunshine. "Mama, Grandpa King," Charlotte called out, running toward them with a painting she had finished that morning. "Look what I made." The painting showed a garden with two figures walking among the flowers. One was clearly meant to be Catherine, identifiable by her long dark hair. The other was a tall figure wearing what appeared to be a crown. "It's you and Mama in the garden," Charlotte explained proudly. "I painted it because you always look happy when you're walking together." Charles felt something shift inside him as he looked at the innocent artwork. From the mouths of babes, he thought. Charlotte had captured something that he hadn't quite recognized himself, that his times with Catherine were when he felt most like himself, most content with his life. That evening, after William's family had returned to their own home, Charles found himself in his private study, but instead of reviewing state papers, he was looking at Charlotte's painting, which he had carefully framed and placed on his desk. His private secretary knocked and entered with the evening briefings. "Your Majesty, there's been another development in the Camilla situation. The press has gotten wind of her frequent meetings with Andrew Parker Bowles, and they're speculating about a reconciliation between them." Charles looked up from the painting. "And how do I feel about that?" His secretary seemed surprised by the question. I'm not sure, Your Majesty. How do you feel about it?" For the first time in years, Charles realized he felt absolutely nothing about Camilla's personal choices. No jealousy, no anger, no regret. Just a mild curiosity, and, if he was being honest, a sense of relief. "I think," Charles said slowly, "that if Camilla has found happiness, then I'm genuinely glad for her." His secretary made a note. "Shall I prepare a statement?" "No need," Charles replied, his gaze returning to Charlotte's painting. "Some things speak for themselves." Later that night, Charles called Catherine on her private line, something he had never done before. "I hope I'm not calling too late," he said when she answered. "Not at all. Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," Charles said, and, for the first time in years, he meant it completely. I just wanted to thank you. Thank me? For what? For helping me remember who I am, he said simply. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Catherine spoke again, her voice was warm with understanding. You don't need to thank me for that, Charles. You just needed someone to remind you that you were worth being yourself with. As he hung up the phone and prepared for bed, King Charles III realized that he was looking forward to tomorrow in a way he hadn't in years. And, for the first time since becoming king, he felt truly ready to embrace whatever the future might bring. Christmas 2024 at Sandringham was unlike any royal Christmas in recent memory. For the first time in years, the atmosphere was relaxed, genuine, and filled with the kind of natural joy that had been missing from royal gatherings for far too long. King Charles moved through the traditional festivities with a lightness in his step that hadn't been seen since before his coronation. Camilla was notably absent from the celebrations, having chosen to spend the holidays quietly at her Wiltshire home with her own children and grandchildren. The separation had been formalized in November, though the palace had managed the announcement with such diplomatic skill that the public received it more as a natural evolution than a scandalous breakdown. Camilla would retain her title but would step back from most official duties, focusing instead on a small number of personal charities. The real surprise of the holiday season was how naturally Catherine had stepped into a more prominent role as the king's chief support system. It wasn't official, and it certainly wasn't romantic. She remained happily married to William and deeply devoted to her children. But something profound had developed between the king and his daughter-in-law, a deep friendship based on mutual respect, shared values, and an understanding of what it meant to serve the crown while maintaining one's humanity. On Christmas morning, as the family gathered for the traditional church service at Sandringham, Charles found himself walking beside Catherine and the children. Photographers captured images of the king laughing with his granddaughter Charlotte, who was telling him an elaborate story about her new Christmas toys. The photos, published worldwide, showed a monarch who looked more relaxed and genuinely happy than he had in years. You know, William said to his father after the service, I haven't seen you this content since before the coronation. Charles considered his son's observation as they walked back toward the house. I think I've finally learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, he replied. I spent so many years afraid of being alone that I stayed in situations that made me feel lonely. The afternoon brought the traditional family gathering in the drawing room, where several generations of royals exchanged gifts and shared stories. Charles watched as Catherine effortlessly managed the children while engaging in meaningful conversations with the adults, mediating small disagreements with grace, and somehow making everyone feel included and valued. When 9-year-old Charlotte approached him with a carefully wrapped package, Charles was touched by the thoughtfulness of her gift, a hand-bound journal with Grandpa King's garden notes, written on the cover in her careful handwriting. Mama said you like to write about your plants, Charlotte explained. So, I made you a special book for your ideas. Charles knelt down to her level, genuinely moved. This is one of the most thoughtful gifts I've ever received, Charlotte. Thank you. Later that evening, after the formal dinner and the children had been put to bed, Charles found himself in the library with Catherine, William, and a few other family members, enjoying a quiet moment by the fire. The conversation had turned to plans for the coming year, and Charles was outlining his vision for expanding his environmental initiatives. What I'd really like to do, he was saying, is create a program that connects young people with sustainable agriculture, something that combines education with practical experience. Catherine's eyes lit up. That sounds wonderful. I've been thinking about ways to expand my work with early childhood development to include environmental awareness. Perhaps we could find ways to coordinate our efforts. William watched this exchange with interest. Over the past months, he had observed the growing friendship between his wife and father with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. Catherine had somehow managed to help his father rediscover his enthusiasm for his role while maintaining perfect propriety and devotion to her own family. The two of you working together would be formidable, William observed with a smile. You share the same passion for making a real difference in people's lives. As the evening wound down and family members began retiring to their rooms, Charles found himself alone with Catherine by the dying fire. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both reflecting on how much had changed over the past year. Can I ask you something personal? Catherine said finally. Of course. Do you regret any of it? The separation from Camilla, the changes to your life? Charles considered her question carefully. I regret the pain it caused Camilla, and I regret that we couldn't find a way to make it work. But regret the changes to my life? No, I don't think I do. What's different now? I think for the first time since becoming king, I feel like I know who I am and what I want to accomplish. I'm not trying to be the king I think people expect me to be, or the husband I think I should be. I'm just trying to be the best version of myself. Catherine smiled. And how does that feel? Liberating, Charles said without hesitation. And peaceful. I wake up each morning excited about the day ahead rather than worried about what might go wrong. I'm glad, Catherine said simply. You deserve to be happy. As they said good night and headed to their respective rooms, Charles reflected on how profoundly his life had changed. A year ago, he had been trapped in a marriage that brought him more stress than joy, struggling with the weight of expectations he couldn't meet, and feeling increasingly isolated despite being surrounded by people. Now, as he settled into his room at Sandringham, King Charles III felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, complete contentment with his life as it actually was, rather than as he thought it should be. His friendship with Catherine had shown him that meaningful relationships didn't require the complicated history and expectations that had weighed down his marriage to Camilla. Sometimes the most profound connections were built on simple things: shared laughter, mutual respect, comfortable silences, and the understanding that being truly seen and accepted was the greatest gift one person could offer another. Outside his window, snow had begun to fall gently on the Norfolk countryside, covering the landscape in pristine white. Charles smiled as he prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new conversations, and the continued joy of a life lived authentically. For the first time in years, the King of England was truly at peace.